right. Good morning and welcome to the AAAS Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology mini workshop on communicating with policymakers. My name is Emily Therese Cloyd. I'm the project director for the AAAS Center for Public Engagement. My colleague Karen Akerlof is here in the front row. She's a visiting scholar with AAAS who is doing some research right now on how 89.1. So Karen is doing some research right now on how scientists and Congress communicate and how Congress uses science. So she's a great person to talk to if you have more questions specifically about communicating with Congress. So the basis of this workshop and all of the work that we do at the AAAS Center for Public Engagement is public engagement. So what do we mean when we say that? We're talking about developing relationships and having a dialogue that allows for everyone who is a part of that conversation to learn from each other and to share information. So, and when we think about who we're trying to reach, obviously with this workshop we're speaking specifically about policymakers, but more generally we're thinking about members of the public and trying to really narrow down and think about who are the specific audiences that you want to talk with as you do public engagement. So when we're thinking about policy, a lot of times folks think about the way that science influences policy in sort of a linear fashion. So there's scientific evidence that drives public opinion drives policy, and it's sort of that linear straight line model. But what we know is that there are a lot of things that influence policy. There's scientific evidence, laws, economics, public opinion, values, interests, and all of those come together and help inform the policy choices that are actually made by policymakers and by individuals who might be advocating for those policies. So I'm going to start with a little mini civics lesson, just to remind you sort of who a policymaker is. So in the federal government, there are the three branches: legislative, which is the branch that makes laws, so Congress, the Senate, the House of Representatives; the executive branch, which actually carries out the laws, so that is the President, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is part of the White House, and then the agencies. So the agencies are actually interpreting what those laws mean and how to actually make them work. And then the judiciary branch evaluates the laws. So things go to the courts, maybe even to the Supreme Court. And so that is another place where scientists may play a role in informing policy. Most states have a very similar structure. So when you're thinking about how you might work with different policymakers, you can sort of think about ways you might work in these different branches of government, regardless of whether you're at the federal level or the state level. Cities are also a great place to interact with policymakers. So we've put up here an example of just one city government, Tracy, California. We didn't pick Tracy for any specific reason, except it had a really straightforward model for how their local government runs. So you can see there's the executive branch, the mayor, the council members, who are more of the legislative branch. They usually are the ones who are making some of the city policies. Under that, city manager, police, fire. All of these are groups that use some form of science as a part of what they're doing, maybe in emergency management, maybe in the way that they run their summer camp programs. They want to have science in those summer camps. So I want to talk a little bit more about agencies. So when you think about an agency, a lot of times you think about the person you might want to talk with is the person who's at the head of that agency or who is the cabinet official. So maybe you want to talk about the Endangered Species Act. So the first person you think of is Secretary Zinke, who is the head of the Department of the Interior. But if you think about who is actually the person who deals with the Endangered Species Act, you have to go down a few more levels. So you might think about interacting with the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is where most of the work on the Endangered Species Act takes place. Under that, the Ecological Services Branch, and then finally the Division of Conservation and Classification, which is where enforcement of the Endangered Species Act actually takes place. So as you're thinking about dealing with policymakers and communicating with policymakers, think about who it is that is working on that particular policy area you're interested in. The other thing that's really interesting about the federal agencies is they often ask for comments before they implement a particular law. Or they might ask for comments once a law is in place if they're thinking about how to revise it. So when they ask for those comments, they do that via a mechanism called the Federal Register. Providing comments via the Federal Register is a really great way to bring your scientific expertise to bear on particular science policy questions. It's published every single day, and you can go to federalregister.gov to find out what's happening in various agencies. In state or local government, there are often similar opportunities to provide comments on pending legislation or other policies. So look for those opportunities. It might be going to a city council meeting and providing testimony. It might be going to the State House. And one of the things that I learned recently from a professor here at University of Texas is when you go to the State House to testify or talk about a particular bill in an open hearing, they'll often have a place for you to sign up in favor of the bill or against the bill or just as a resource. So if you're going there and you're trying to provide some scientific evidence that might help policymakers just think more about that bill, you can sign up as a resource and provide your scientific information that way without necessarily saying you're pro or against the bill. So let's take a look at the policymaking process just to get a sense of where science might fit in. So we're using the example here of the Endangered Species Act. So we start with reviewing the evidence, trying to understand, are eagles endangered? And so we look at the numbers of eagles, nesting pairs, the number of eagle chicks, and so forth. That will help us understand if they're endangered and what the options might be for listing them as endangered species or as threatened or taking action to conserve that particular species. So that's one place that scientists can provide input, is in that review of evidence stage. They might also provide some input in appraising the different options. What might work best for conserving and actually helping the eagles thrive? Ultimately, the policymakers will assess the risks and uncertainties associated with a particular policy option, choose which option to go with, implement it, and then over time continue to collect information, monitor progress of the eagles. That's another place for scientists to provide some input. As you're monitoring the progress of the eagles, you can provide input on what's happening. Are they thriving? Are they still threatened? Are they endangered? Should they be removed from listing? And then that policy process continues through the years, and you can continue to provide input in a number of places. So take a minute right now. You have a worksheet where we've given you some questions where you can start to think about your own policy engagement. And so you want to think about what level is your science being used at, because it may be that the best place for you to work with policymakers is at the national level, but it may be that your science is really most being used at the local level. And so you want to start engaging with some of those city or state lawmakers. So you think about that for a second. I'm just going to take a quick poll from the audience. As you're thinking about the science that you're doing, who thinks that most of what they're doing is applicable at the federal level? Okay. The state level? A few more, great. And at the local level? Wonderful. Yeah, so think about that and use that to help shape what your ultimate goals will be and who the policymakers are that you might want to reach. We're going to do that today by thinking about the public engagement framework that we provide from AAAS to help you think about how you plan your engagement with policymakers, how you implement it, and then how you evaluate that engagement. So we'll start first with your goal. So why do you want to engage with policymakers in the first place? It could be that you want to help spur new legislation, either at the federal, state, or local level. It could be that there's already legislation in the pipeline that you're interested in commenting on, helping to shape that legislation, give more information that might be useful for it. Or if the legislation isn't already in place, how is that legislation actually implemented? Oftentimes, the bills that are passed in Congress or by state legislatures still need a lot of interpretation from the executive branch agencies that are charged with implementing them. So those agencies have to figure out exactly what does it mean to list an animal as endangered? How many bald eagles do there have to be for it to be endangered versus threatened versus no longer listed? So that's an area where you think about maybe you want to work more with the executive branch agency than on the congressional side. You may also want to engage with the public around issues that have policy relevance, even if you're not talking about a specific piece of legislation or a particular law that's already in place. You may also be interested in just asking a policymaker to support scientific research more generally, either in the field that you're working in or just support for science. You also want to think about how do you want to interact with policy. So there are sort of two different ways to think about this. There's policy for science, so that is things like how much funding should the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health receive. That impacts how research is conducted and practiced. It may also be things that talk about ethics in research. There's also science for policy, so that's providing science that might inform or enhance the development and implementation of specific policies. I see a number of you are taking pictures of the slides. That's great. I also want to let you know at the end, we're going to give you a link for a survey. If you take that survey, or if you sign up and give us your email address in the back, we will send you a copy of these slides. So you're welcome to take pictures now so you remember stuff, but you can also get the slides afterwards. Can I get... There's a lot of radio frequencies going on. The clicker doesn't always work. All right, so again, on your worksheets, there's a question that says, what is your goal? So you want to think about both your big picture goal, how do you want policy to change as a result of including science? Or how do you want the science and society relationship to change as a result of engaging with policymakers? You also want to think about your individual goals. So what is it that you want to do? Why do you want to engage with policymakers? And what do you hope to accomplish as a result of your engagement? So I'm going to give you maybe a minute or so to think about what your goal is. And I'm going to ask you, once you jot down a note or two, to go ahead and turn to the person next to you, which means you might have to take out your headset, and talk to them about what that goal is. So I'm going to give you maybe 3 minutes total to jot down your notes, talk to your neighbor, and then I will try to get you all back into your headset. So just watch for me to wave my arms around when that time has come. All right, if you can hear me, go ahead and poke your neighbor and tell them to put their headphones back on. Right, and I promise to give you some more time to chat about your goals and all the other parts of your engagement. So go ahead and slide those headsets back on. Come back up to the front for your attention. And we're going to think a little bit more about the role that scientists play in the policy-making process. So there are a number of different roles that scientists might play in the policy-making process. We've broken them down into 4 categories. This is just one way to think about it. You may see some other ways to think about your role as a scientist. The first role scientists might play is as a pure scientist. So that is someone who is summarizing the state of knowledge in a particular field, sort of putting it out there, this is the science. Another role might be a science arbiter. So Perhaps there are specific policy options that the policymaker has asked about, and the scientist provides science that will be used to evaluate and think about those different options. An issue advocate advocates for or even reduces down particular policy options based on the science that they're using. Oftentimes, the issue advocate may be bringing their own values into the discussion. That's fine, but it's also important to be clear about what it is that is making you be an advocate for that particular set of policy options. And then finally, there's a role called honest broker, which often can use science to clarify or even expand the range of options that policymakers are considering. So none of these four roles is wrong or right, but it is important for you to think about the role that you want to play and the role that you might be perceived to play by the policymakers or others that you're interacting with. So to think about these roles in a different sense, let's say that your friend is visiting and they ask you for recommendations about where they should go eat dinner. The pure scientist might just say, well, a healthy diet is one that includes dairy and fruits and vegetables and bread and eggs, and so you should pick a place where you'll be able to eat a balanced diet. But I'm not going to tell you which meals you should eat that for. The science arbiter might answer questions in the style of an information desk. So the friend might say, hey, have you heard about Torchy's Tacos? Tell me, is that any good? The issue advocate recommends their favorite restaurant. So the issue advocate would say, Chuy's is great. That is definitely where you should go to get your tacos. The honest broker would provide information about all the different restaurants in town and say, here's information about Chuy's, here's information about Torchy's, but there are also these other restaurants that you might think about. So now think for a second about how you see yourself in specifically related to that goal, the role that you see yourself playing. Is it a pure scientist, a science arbiter, an issue advocate, or an honest broker? And also think about how you'll acknowledge that role in the interactions that you have with policymakers. So on your sheet, go ahead and jot down some notes about the role that you want to play. I'll give you a minute to do that.
So we're now at the point in time where we know thousands and we know a little bit about what is happening. We see the distribution of sizes that improves our immune system that has everything including
Okay. The next step in thinking about engaging with policymakers is to think about your audience. So we know your audience is a policymaker, but what do you actually know about that particular policymaker or set of policymakers? So here is a message from Representative Sherry Boehlert, who is the former chair of the House Science Committee. And he wants to make sure scientists understand that it's important to remember not all people are going to reach the same policy conclusion based on the same scientific information. They may understand and accept that information, but thinking back to that policy ecosystem diagram we had earlier on, there are a lot of other things at play in the ultimate policy choice. So what is a policymaker? Many times people, when you ask them what is a policymaker, the first thing they think about is their elected official. So you might think about Eddie Bernice Johnson, who represents a district in Texas. She is the ranking member on the House Science Committee. It could also be a governor, a state legislator, a mayor, or a city council member. But there are also the staff of these elected officials. Oftentimes it's the staff that you'll end up talking with if you go to talk about a particular piece of legislation or a particular policy that's in place or might be coming into force. So there are personal office staff that work specifically for that elected official. There are also committee staff. So it could be the House Science Committee staff. It could be the City Council's Committee on Fair Housing. And you're talking to that committee staff. They often have more specialized expertise and knowledge about that issue, but many times the personal office staff also have knowledge and work on a specific set of issues. And then there are also the agency employees. Some are political appointees and some are career staff. But all of them play a role in the policymaking process and could be considered a policymaker. So as you're getting ready to engage with the policymakers, you want to make sure that you do your homework. Think about what connections you might already have to them. Are you their constituent? Do they serve your particular district? Do they serve the university that you work for? Do you work at a national lab and they are in charge of, they're on the committee that's in charge of funding national labs? Think about the particular issues that they say they care about. So you can go to the web page for most elected officials and they'll have a tab that says issues. So again, this is the web page for Eddie Bernice Johnson, and she is interested in healthcare, immigration, infrastructure, and mental health. So when you think about how you might speak to her, particularly if you are interested in these issues, or you know that she is the ranking member on House Science, that will help you understand how you might want to speak with her, what you might want to use to frame your message, and how you might want to make some of those connections. You also want to think about the timing of your interaction. So let's say that you want to go talk to a policymaker about funding for science. You want to make sure you're talking with them during the time that they're actually considering the budget. You don't want to go the day after they pass the big budget bill. So think about what you know about the legislative process or about the executive agency's process, and make sure that you are providing information in a timely fashion. So take a minute to think about who your particular audience is. So earlier on, I asked you to raise your hands if you were working at the state level, the local level, the federal level. Think about that particular audience, what you already know about them, what they care about, what issues they're working on, what committees they're working on, and think about how you hope to influence them, where you might build on some of those shared interests or connections. So go ahead, take a minute to jot down some notes, and then again, I'm going to ask you to take out the headphones and talk to your neighbor for just a minute about that. All right, the last part of planning for your engagement with policymakers is your message. What do you actually say when you start that conversation and continue that conversation with the policymaker? So I want to start with a caveat. Most policymakers, or at least many policymakers, are suffering from information overload. And that goes for the elected officials as well as their staff. They start out their day, maybe they're listening to the radio, they get NPR, or they get the local news station, they're hearing what's happening. Maybe they turn on the television while they eat their breakfast, or they're opening their email, they're reading the newspaper, they're driving, or they're taking the subway to work. They're already, by the time they get to work, they've already had maybe 30 emails or bits of information that they're trying to deal with. They get more emails, they talk to people, they talk on the phone, they get regular mail, they eat their lunch, but they're probably eating their lunch at their computer, watching the news, seeing the emails roll in. Maybe they have some more meetings, they have some more phone calls, they look on the television. By the time that they're headed home, they're completely saturated in terms of the amount of information that they've gotten and what they're able to remember. So when you're thinking about your message, you want to create something that will stick out, that they will remember, and that won't take too much time for them to actually think about and digest. Those policymakers, what they really want to know is, why should I care about what it is you're telling me? how does this issue affect my constituents, and what can I do about it? They don't want to just get all the information, they want to be able to take action. So what you want are effective messages. Messages that are relevant to that particular policymaker and that are local, that apply to their district, that apply to their city or their state. They don't necessarily want to be hearing about Alaska if they're representing a district here in Texas. So think about how you can connect your research, even if it is in Alaska, to someone who is here in Texas. So why do you want to think about your messages in advance? Developing those messages will help you anticipate the sorts of questions that you might get from policymakers. It will help you draw them into the conversation, and it will help you speak without notes so that you can concentrate on the conversation rather than on your piece of paper in front of you. Messages also help your audience. They help your audience connect to you, they help your audience pay attention, and they help your audience remember you when you leave. We often talk about the 3 M's of message to help you remember how you can create some really great messages. So you want to create messages that are miniature, memorable, and meaningful. So when we talk about miniature, we're really talking about something you could fit on a Post-it note or a little card that you stick in your pocket. Maybe 3 key points. Those could be key findings from your research or the results of your research. But something that you could review before you go into the meeting, just take a quick peek and say, all right, I'm ready, going in. So here's an example. This comes from Jeff Dukes, who leads the Indiana Climate Change Assessment. He wanted to provide useful climate change information to Indiana decision makers. So he knew his audience was going to be folks in the government representing and working on a variety of issues ranging from energy to municipal planning to agriculture to risk management and hazard reduction. So when he was thinking about the miniature messages that he wanted to bring to those conversations, he wanted to talk about the fact that the Indiana Climate Assessment includes scientists and people from many sectors from all parts of Indiana. It's a way to catalyze conversation about climate change in Indiana. How is it affecting our state? This assessment empowers better decision making by Hoosiers, and he would then provide an audience-specific example. And you can see a few examples here. So perhaps he's talking to someone who's interested in water management. So he might want to talk to them about how climate change could mean reduced water, or perhaps reduced air quality if he's talking to someone who's interested in air quality. Maybe he's talking to someone who is interested in energy. So he talks about how climate change can increase demand for cooling, which then increases the amount of energy that needs to be produced. And then his final message, so he actually had 4, was that interested people can get involved in the climate change assessment. The first step is to sign up for the newsletter. So he had a very specific thing that people could do if they wanted to get more information. When he was speaking to specific policymakers, he might change that first step to something like, bring science into this particular regulation, or use it to inform the way that this particular regulation is enforced. Something else to think about in your message is the words that you're using, and how the words that you use as a scientist may mean something completely different to a policymaker. So a word like manipulation to a scientist might mean different data sets and different experiments. To a policymaker, it means deceit. So you don't want to go in there and talk about how you manipulated your different experiments and you got all these great results, because what they're hearing is you made it all up. Another word that might cause some problem, reconciliation. So that might mean correcting your data, looking across experiments. To a policymaker, reconciliation is a specific point in the budget process when the House and the Senate come together and talk about what is different in their bills and how they can make it the same. So I'm going to give you a little bit more time now to actually think about what you want your messages to be. So think about what are your 3 key words or key phrases that you want to be able to put on that Post-it note that's in your pocket. Think about messages that are miniature, memorable, and meaningful. And think about what you want your audience to remember and take away from that conversation. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes or so to jot down notes, and then again, turn to the folks around you and talk about your messages. Give it a try and see what your colleagues think about those messages. So we've moved on to the implementation stage of our public engagement framework. So how are you actually going to engage with these policymakers? You've thought about your goal, you've thought about the audience itself, what you already know about them, how you might want to connect, and you've thought about a small message, your 3 key points that you want to use to get the conversation kicked off. But how do you actually engage them? So the first way I mentioned a little earlier, there's written correspondence with policymakers. So this could be writing an email or a letter or a postcard. It could be providing public comments via the Federal Register, which you can do online at federalregister.gov. It could be writing an op-ed that you then use as the basis for a letter to that policymaker, where you point out, look, here's an op-ed where I've given a little bit more background on this issue, and then send that in with a short letter, or if you're doing it electronically, with a short email introduction. And you can see over here on the, what side is that for you? The right side. Here's an example of some postcards that came in during the federal budget process last year, talking about the need for science funding, saying that strong science would lead to a strong America. And then on the back, scientists and others wrote information about what particular kinds of science they were interested in, particular agencies, particular research projects. They talked a little bit more just what would fit on a postcard. You might also interact with your policymakers in person. So you don't have to go to Washington, D.C. to meet with members of Congress. You can go to their local office. They usually have at least one and oftentimes several offices in their district, or if they're a senator, around the state. You might go to meetings at federal or state offices in the state capitol, either with the legislators or with the agency officials. You might go to committee meetings. So perhaps that committee is having a hearing and they have asked for input as a part of that hearing process. Or you go and you just want to listen, you want to hear a little bit more about how that committee meeting works. And that will help you understand how you want to go back and formulate your messages and the sorts of things you want to talk about. You might also have a phone call. And if you've never called your legislator, I encourage you to try it. It's a pretty low risk activity because oftentimes the phones are answered by the interns. So you don't have to have a long script written out. You usually just call in and you say, hi, my name is Jane Scientist. I wanted to call and tell you a little bit about my interest in funding for science. I think that science funding is really important and that the congressperson should support funding for the NIH. The person says, yes, that's great. They make a little check mark that says, we got a call today about supporting the NIH budget. They say thank you, hang up the phone. So give it a try. It's a nice little dip your toe in the policymaker engagement arena. Pool, I guess that is. Other in-person interactions, you might give testimony at a hearing. You might partake in a congressional briefing where you are providing some information as a part of that briefing panel. You might go to a town hall or a city council meeting, again, provide some testimony or talk with policymakers. You might be given an interview in the press that you know that policymaker might see. And so you think about how you're speaking with the press and how that might filter up to others. Or you might be taking part in an advocacy or professional organization initiative. So an association like AAAS hosts a yearly Climate Science Day on the Hill in conjunction with a number of other scientific societies, where they bring scientists who work on climate change up to the Hill to talk with a variety of lawmakers about the science of climate change. They don't have a particular policy objective except to provide some more information about climate science, about the impacts of climate change. So they're working more in that role of providing the science rather than advocating for a particular issue or policy. So here's something that we did before we had the workshop. Last week, we put up a little poll on our Twitter where we asked the science policy community to tell us what they thought about the best way to connect with policymakers. And you can see we got 13 votes, so not a huge sample, but 92% of the people who voted said in-person meeting was the best way to connect with policymakers. I especially like this comment from someone who said, it really depends on if you know the person. The first contact might actually be best done by phone or in person. So, you talk to the person, you set up something. Once you get that good connection, you might be able to rely on things like emails or phone calls to have more conversation. So how much influence do some of these strategies have on members of Congress and on their staff? Just like we heard in our poll just now, in-person issue visits from constituents tend to have the most positive influence on policymakers. Contact from constituent reps, so that might be maybe the government relations person from your university who's representing the larger group of scientists, also has a fair amount of influence. Individualized emails and postal letters are also really great. So that is, write something, put your own story in it, put your own messages in it. A lot of organizations make it pretty easy to just click and say, send this off to your congressperson. They get a lot of those. Providing some really individualized attention where you talk about the specific issues for that policymaker will really get it on their radar. So the last piece of our framework that I'm going to talk about pretty briefly is evaluation. So how do you know if this is making a difference? So there are some things you can do right away. Actually, you can go back just a second. Audience feedback, so you're in there, you're having a conversation. Is the person paying attention to you, or are they looking at their cell phone and reading all the other emails that have come in during that 15 or 30-minute meeting? So you can use that to gauge right away, are you connecting? Maybe you need to change your message, change your tactic just a little bit to help with that connection. You also want to make sure that you're doing some self-reflection, so thinking about, did I enjoy this? Do I think that I was able to get across what I wanted to get across? What might I want to do differently in the future? And then you can also do some formal evaluation. That might be a little bit harder with policymakers. You're probably not going to be able to send them a survey and say, tell me how well I did on this particular interaction. But you do want to think about, if you're going to be doing this over a long period of time, how might you be a little bit more formal in evaluating what's working and what's not working? So you also want to think about how can you establish relationships. So you want to make sure that if you go and you meet with a person, you follow up with an email and a thank you note that says, thank you for taking some time to meet with me. During that meeting, you asked me about issue X, and I said I would get back to you. Here's that information. So draw on a question or a comment and use that to provide a little bit more information, a little bit more personalization, and build that relationship up. So this is the last piece of your worksheet, and that's to think about your next steps. So what are the things that you will do right now in the next maybe week or month as you think about how you can start to engage with policymakers, Think about when you'll do them, and think about how you'll measure your success and how that might lead you into future engagements. So I'm just going to go through the last few slides as you think about that. Please take the worksheet home with you, go back through it, think about how you want to engage in the future, how you can use that to structure your engagement planning. This workshop was just an hour long, but we do offer longer 3-hour workshops that focus on science communication and public engagement, on social media, and a 3-hour long workshop on policy. So you can find more information about those at AAAS.org/communicating-science-workshops. We'll come to your institution to do workshops. You can get more information there. Here at the meeting, if you think you've started to formulate your message, you have a particular audience in mind, I encourage you to visit our Share Your Science booth. You can come here and make a 1 or 2 minute long video where you talk a little bit about your science and how it relates to society. We'll film you and then send you that video. You can use it on social media, you can use it on your website. It's a nice little introduction to the work that you do and how it relates to the wider world. We'll be here all day from 12 to 5 today, and then tomorrow from 12 to 5, and it's sort of kitty corner from here over in booth 1615. And we'll have public engagement staff on hand to help you sort of craft and polish up that message and really get you ready for camera. We also have today and tomorrow Family Science Days. This is a great way to see what public engagement looks like. It's also a great way to get a free lightsaber if you get there quick. Don't all run out just yet. But there's some pretty fun swag. There's a lot of really great demonstrations of science, some really good talks. There's Meet an Astronaut taking place pretty soon. So I encourage you to head on over there and check that out. And then tonight, there's a public engagement networking reception over at the Hilton starting at 6:30. So if you're interested in public engagement, come over there, eat some food, drink some drinks, meet others interested in public engagement, and continue some of the conversations that we've started today. Also, if you're interested more in being a resource for media, you can visit the Sciline booth. That's booth 1516, so it's actually just across the way from the Sharing Your Science booth. And you can learn about some opportunities to be a resource for journalists. Sciline is a new resource that AAAS started up to provide science information to reporters. They're also looking for scientists that they'll be able to refer reporters to. So if you're an expert in a particular area, they are looking for you. You can also visit the Force for Science Toolkit, which provides a number of resources related to engaging policymakers as well as other science advocacy. You can go to forceforscience.org/toolkit. If you just go to forceforscience.org, you'll see there's a red button right in the middle to sign up for additional information related to policy engagement. So I encourage you to visit that if you're interested in staying informed on what AAAS is doing and how you might continue to engage policymakers. Finally, we have an online community called Trellis that provides a space for you to continue discussions with scientists, public engagement practitioners, and researchers who are interested in public engagement. This is a great way to learn about what's happening in the field of public engagement, policy engagement. We have a community, in addition to the public engagement community linked up there, we have a community related to engaging scientists and engineers in policy, so that's a great way to sort of see what's happening, find more resources. So with that, I will end. If you have questions, you can come up and talk to me at the front of the stage. Otherwise, please take off your headphones and just leave them on your seat, and we'll come around and collect them once you're done. Note right there, survey, AAAS.org/workshop-survey. If you take the survey, which we would love for you to do because we want to know how you think this went, we will send you a copy of these slides. So please take that survey, help us make these workshops better in the future, tell us what you liked and didn't like, and thank you for coming today.